Hi, everyone. We're just going to give it an extra minute to let some folks trickle in before we get started. Okay, I want to be mindful of everyone's time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Courtney Taylor, Grants Program Officer, Community Partnerships for the York County Community Foundation, and your point of contact for the York County Nonprofit Collaborative. This just heads up that this webinar will be recorded and posted on our collaborativeyork.org website. It's my pleasure to introduce David Gonzalez, Director, Economic Initiatives and Advocacy for the York County Economic Alliance, who is our Policy and Advocacy Workgroup co-chair and is going to share a little bit more about that workgroup and introduce our presenter.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you again for joining us for today's Advocacy 101 webinar, hosted by the York County Nonprofit Collaboratives Policy and Advocacy Work Group. As Courtney mentioned, my name is David, and I serve as the co-chair along with Heather Hallman for the work group. One of the collaborative's key goals is to build capacity for advocacy among York County nonprofits, and today's webinar is the first installment of that. The work group also created 3 policy papers, which are available under the resources tab on collaborativeyork.org, and we can drop that in the chat here shortly, which we encourage you to check out. They highlight key issues impacting our community and can help inform and strengthen your own advocacy efforts. We're glad you're here and taking time to strengthen your organization's voice. Advocacy is a powerful tool and a completely appropriate tool for nonprofits to use to advance their missions and serve their communities. Frankly, it's essential in today's climate. Today, to advocate for your organizations through both education and talk about the crucial programs that you provide to our community. Today's session is designed to help demystify and clarify advocacy and lobbying and to give you practical tools to engage confidently and effectively. We appreciate your commitment to this work um, and for all that you do for York County at large. Before I introduce our speaker, I also like to give a shout out to Courtney, as she has been the backbone for a lot of the collaborative's work and working behind the scenes to ensure today's webinar works fluidly. So thank you, Courtney. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Sarah Gabel, who is a member of the work group, board member of the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations, also known as PANO, and is an overall powerhouse in the realm of advocacy. Sarah will lead us through today's presentation, and at the end of her presentation, we'll leave some time for Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you also to Courtney. We really appreciate your help. We have a decent number of slides today. However, this should be an interactive process, so please feel free to drop questions. We'll have a couple of questions for you as we go through this. And this presentation is really designed to hopefully spark your interest in taking the next steps to make sure that your elected officials know who you are, know your organizational mission, understand the impact that you have in the community, and understand why it's so important to engage with you when they are considering policies that might have an impact upon your organization or your community. So to just get us started, this is kind of an overview that we're going to talk about. A pretty heavy focus today is going to be on what 501c3s can and cannot do, because a lot of the hesitancy that we see within the nonprofit community for getting involved in advocacy is that, hey, is this going to impact our 501c3 status? Is this going to put us into jeopardy with the IRS? So we'll make sure that we cover all the ways to appropriately engage in advocacy and not get yourselves into any trouble, either at the state or the federal level. And of course, a quick overview of the necessary paperwork that has to be maintained in order to do that. We'll go in through some of the basics of lobbying just to kind of demystify the process. Lobbying is not a four-letter word. I always like to say it's really just about educating the people who represent your community, and they should know you and know about what you are doing. So the most effective ways to make that case, and then of course, tracking those expenses to, again, make sure you stay out of trouble with the IRS. So we're in a bit of a moment right now for nonprofits and frankly for organizations of all kinds, from everything from healthcare to human services to childcare to criminal justice reform. There's a lot going on at all of the different levels of government. So broadly, advocacy is active support for a cause, idea, or policy. Just to frame the overall concept for you. Lobbying is a type of advocacy. So whether you are applying your education skills to the communities that you serve and educating them on what you have available for them in terms of programs and services, whether you are educating donors to try and convince them to either start or continue supporting your organization, is no different than the kinds of advocacy that you would be doing with your elected officials. This applies to all levels of government. So that is from your local level, where you might want to ask for a zoning variance in order to establish a new food bank or outreach idea, to the county level, because there are funding available at the county level. And so making sure that your county commissioners know who your organization is and what you do can help you when you apply for grant funding, to the state level, where frankly, most of what impacts nonprofits is happening at the state level. And that's everything from how and when and how often you need to register your organization, the guidelines for audits for any state-connected grant funding, the annual registration for advocacy at the state level. It's all controlled there, all the way up to the federal level, where mostly we're talking about revenue and your 501c3 status. Today, we're going to specifically be talking about advocacy to all of those government agencies and why it is important. Oh, well, I forgot that this slide was here. So that's kind of great that it worked right into that. So there's a lot of concern from board members and from executives of different nonprofits about the minefields that can present themselves when we're talking about advocacy at the government level. So it is important to recognize that, yes, there is a pathway to do this. Nonprofits are often doing a disservice to their mission if they are not regularly engaging with their government officials, because the policies that rule not just how nonprofits operate, but also the policies that can really make our work easier or less easy. I also like to point out that lobbying is an interesting undertaking for a lot of people that grow tired of facing the same problem with the same tools every single day. So often a change in policy is the most direct way to try and shift the conversation or lessen the need or provide a better service in your community. So it's kind of astonishing to me that less than 3% of nonprofits lobby to advance their mission, compared to the 100% that have the legal right to do so, because this has been a strong focus of the National Council of Nonprofits, as well as the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations, for quite some time. So there are a lot of efforts at the national and at the state level to try and help nonprofits advance their mission with policy, especially in an environment that we are seeing now, where there is another level of discussion happening and people are much more aware of the policies that are coming forth without a ton of input from the communities, in a lot of cases, that actually have to either implement or support the people who are facing all of those changes. So this is the actual definition of lobbying. So lobbying is defined as direct communication with federal or state officials for the purpose of influencing legislation or regulatory action. So the reason why this definition is important is because this is the guideline for what qualifies as lobbying for that 501c3 definition. So there are limits to how much nonprofits can engage in lobbying. So that is directly influencing a legislative or regulatory action. There are no limits on the amount of education that a nonprofit can do. So the differences are that if you are going to be hiring a registered lobbyist, that would be concluded under lobbying because that would be directly attempting to influence legislation. Working with or leading coalitions to pass or to oppose legislation, testifying before an elected official or an elective body. So that's, in hearings, policy committee, education committee, anything like that. Encouraging regulatory changes, so submitting a letter to the Department, again, of Education, Department of Health, asking them to change a regulation or to update a regulation, submitting written testimony to a legislative body or asking your opinion to be included with the vote, or urging the public to take action. So if you are including a stance on a piece of legislation in a newsletter and encouraging your members or the people that you serve to take action, that would be considered lobbying. So just to reiterate, communicating with lawmakers, taking a position, telling the public how to vote on a particular bill or issue, and urging your members to take a position on a particular vote or issue, or to endorse or support a particular candidate would all be part of the definitions of lobbying for the purposes of your 501c3 status. Oh, I'm sorry. So this was supposed to be a question for everyone. So one of these things is not considered lobbying, and that is urging your members to vote for certain candidates. That is not considered lobbying because it's not taking a position on a particular piece of legislation or a regulation, but actually electioneering, and we will talk about that shortly. So what is excluded from that definition of lobbying? And that includes providing research and education, like I mentioned. So what does that mean? So talking about the circumstances under which you operate. So for example, currently we are facing a dramatic increase in the amount of state responsibility for paying for the administrative costs of the SNAP program. So this is something that nonprofits are going to have to be aware of because it's going to impact the state budget. Facing another budget impasse has a huge impact on nonprofits in York County. So communicating to your partners, your donors, your members, and saying, we work with this population, we're facing this reality, and this is how it's going to impact people, is not lobbying. When you get to the next step of saying, please support this legislation that protects nonprofits in the event of a budget impasse, now that would be considered lobbying. If you respond to requests, so I would really encourage everyone who is a part of this webinar or whoever watches this, the simplest thing that you can do to start developing a relationship with your elected officials is to add them to your mailing lists. They are elected. They want to meet voters. They want to know what's going on in their communities. So you should have them. It's as simple as calling the office and asking if there's a contact or a general email box that you can add to your list. They would love to hear from you. But if you do start to build that relationship and a bill comes before them and they want to know what the position of the nonprofit community is, if you respond to that request for information about how this particular policy would affect you, that is not considered lobbying. That falls under education as well. Any issues affecting your exempt status, so anything where you are reaching out to an elected official to ask questions about federal rules. So for example, talking to your congressman or senator about your exemption status is not considered lobbying. Applying for grant funding for government bodies, testifying before a committee can or cannot. So you will have seen it, in that previous one that sometimes it can. So if you are testifying before a committee on the current state of affordable housing in York County and how the efforts of the land bank are impacting that availability, that would not be considered lobbying. However, if the hearing was on a piece of legislation to expand opportunities for land banks to get grant funding to do more work in their communities to expand affordable housing, well then, and the testimony that you're giving is expressly in support of that legislation, then that would be considered lobbying. You can always invite elected officials to events. They love to speak. They are looking for opportunities to connect. So that's always a great idea, and that would not be considered lobbying. And of course, to reiterate, adding elected officials to your mailing list, which absolutely everyone should do. So nonpartisan. There is the ability. So nonprofits are not permitted to endorse candidates, and nonprofits in Pennsylvania cannot provide campaign funding. Now that's because corporations in Pennsylvania are not allowed to provide campaign funding. So that's not something that we need to worry about at all. However, a nonprofit cannot say, yep, we love Governor Shapiro, we're going to endorse him on behalf of our church or our nonprofit organization. Nonprofits cannot do that without jeopardizing their 501c3 status. However, they can do things that promote educational events. So you can host a candidate forum as long as it is nonpartisan, meaning that everyone was invited. Everyone does not need to show up, but everyone needs to be invited if you are going to host some kind of candidate forum. Obviously, displaying signs for particular candidates is not a good idea. And wearing a candidate button at work or other political statement supporting a particular candidate while at work could cause an issue for the nonprofit. I would say too that anyone who's operating like at an executive level, so your CFO, your executive director, should also be aware when they are participating in politics and be very clear about not doing so on any time that would be attributed to the nonprofit, and making sure that if they are participating in politics actively, that there's very strict differentiation between their off hours and their nonprofit duties, just to be extra safe. So there are sometimes in messaging where it's going to require a political lens in order to do something that is mission critical. So right now we are facing a situation where missions that focus on encouragement of diversity have suddenly become much more political than they were in the past. So there are minefields that nonprofits should be aware of. Not that it's in any way advocating that anyone changes how they are doing anything, but just for the purposes of making sure that your nonprofit is going to be in compliance with the 501c3. It's just something to be aware of at a risk level for boards or for anyone that is engaging in advocacy, that certain language is now being given more scrutiny at the federal level in a lot of cases. That being said, the attempted attacks on some nonprofit organizations that have been coming from the federal level to this point have not borne any fruit. And so the actions that are mission critical to those organizations are still being undertaken, but it may cause an additional risk level that nonprofits should be aware of. So just to think carefully when you are putting forth and start getting interested and active in advocacy or having a candidate forum, like you have every constitutional right to do, just to flag for your board so that the organizational leadership is all on the same page about any potential political risk that is being taken, and everyone is in agreement that it is still a good idea for what they are undertaking. As an example, one of the things that the PANO board adopted during COVID was to embed the language on the screen to make public statements. And so they did that to put out, a public statement about masking policies was like on the PANO website, which became a political statement. There was pushback on that because they chose to do that on behalf of their organization and considered it something basic to the health and safety of the organization. But just to use that as an example, it's something to review as you are considering how and when to get involved in advocacy. Okay, so to get back to the overall understanding of the webinar itself today, it's what 501c3s can do, and that is building relationships. So everything in politics is relationships, just like I would say apply the same principles that you would apply to your donor management, that you kind of have to have those regular touches. You want to build a relationship and keep an ongoing conversation with your major donors or with all of your donors. It's the same thing. So these are stakeholders to be worked with who are just as interested in your success as you are. They want to know what services that you offer, because one wonderful thing about especially state legislative offices is that they are a hub for people to find information. So please, I encourage you to reach out to them, whenever you've got something coming up, an event that they might want to attend, or send a staff member to attend. Invite them to, your outreach events. If you have new materials, a new report, a new brochure, pamphlet, a lot of offices will have those there. So if you are targeting a particular demographic, so you have wonderful services for older Pennsylvanians, and you want to ask them to keep some brochures at their office because they have a number of people come through the door every day, that's perfectly acceptable and a wonderful way to build that relationship. But the goal is to really create an ongoing dialogue so that when you want to take a position on an issue, they will hear from you and take your advice to heart. Or better yet, if they hear about a policy that's coming down, they will actively solicit your feedback. And one of the wonderful things about having worked so many years in the legislature, I was a staffer for 10 years in Harrisburg, is that it helped people to get to a place where they could find compromise when they had constituents back home that could support them. So in those cases where the two parties are really far apart on an issue and nobody is willing to create compromise, even though the issue is something that is bipartisan and really is going to help hundreds of people or thousands of people across the Commonwealth, it's those opportunities to say, well, I understand that my party leadership is telling me this. However, this nonprofit in my district is telling me something else. And they are the people that I report to. They're the people that give me the seat. And so I have to vote to support their interests. And that is an acceptable reason for breaking ranks a lot of the time. So it does help to build that community. And from the advocacy level, so people like me who were in Harrisburg all the time and trying to push these reforms and changes and really support the issues that matter to nonprofits, it's kind of the only way that we can really push votes or flip votes or work around them. The most effective thing in the world is to be able to bring in a constituency group that can come in and say, hey, this is how it impacts our community directly. So this is a wonderful first start to really being able to affect change, not just at the local level, but statewide and possibly even nationwide. So that's one way to just keep reaching out, put them on your mailing lists, cultivate relationships with the staff. They often are the first point of contact. And I always like to say that, frankly, a lot of the staffers at certain times of the year, they're going to have more face time with that member of the legislature than their spouse will, because they're with them all the time. I'm sure all of you guys have, work spouses that you that you see all the time and that you can chat with and that know what's going on in your day to day because they share that work environment. So those staff members do the same thing. So building a relationship with them is great. I can tell you for a fact, they all love calendars and swag and having things on their desks. So there's always an opportunity to connect that way. I tend to bring really cute animal calendars. That's great. And it kind of keeps animals top of mind for all the different staff members, which is always a plus for the work that I do. Promoting voting registration. There's no limits whatsoever on nonprofits having voter registration. I'm not sure how many of you are watching some of this stuff that's happening at the federal level, but there's a move to pretty much, severely curtail mail-in voting at the federal level. So that's going to make it really important for people to update their voter registration and make sure that everything is accurate. So that is a wonderful way to, reach out and partner with different elected officials and do voter drives that can really help keep people, active and work, able to connect with their fundamental right to vote, but also to give you another touch point with those elected officials, with the caveat that you should not be meeting with candidates in their campaign headquarters. You can also create candidate questionnaires. If you are really kind of ready to next level it on your advocacy, you can create a questionnaire that is just the issues that matter most to your organization, and then request the candidates to answer it. Again, that has to be done in a nonpartisan way, so it has to go to everyone. But it's a great starting point for the relationship. If there's like an open seat, for example, that gives you then a way to follow up once the election happens, to introduce yourself and the mission of your organization and remind them of the positions that they can take. Again, that candidate forum. And of course, education for the people that you work with, that they have a fundamental right to vote. And if there is a policy that could make their lives easier, registering to vote is obviously the first step in making their voice heard in that process. We also have nonpartisan voter guides if you really want to double down on these options. And then community conversations, giving staff PTO to vote, helping to transport to the polls, and then, of course, issue advocacy. That can continue all the way through the life cycle of an election. In Pennsylvania, our state legislative sessions are 2 years long. So once a bill is introduced, it has 2 years before it expires, and then it can be introduced in the next session. So our process at the state level, at least, is pretty much constant. So there's always an issue coming up. There's always a committee vote to take an action on. All right, so setting up your advocacy program structure and how to get going. So if you have decided that this is a great idea for your organization and you'd really like to just kind of get started, there's a number of steps that can go into this to try and make it as easy as possible. So the first, of course, is board buy-in and support. Not to throw my own profession under the bus, but lawyers love to be on boards and lawyers love to find problems. So feel free to send them to me or to send them this webinar. Or we've created with our partners over at panonprofitlaw.org a complete comprehensive guide to advocacy for nonprofits that's much more in-depth than this is, but it's expressly good for lawyers who are very concerned. It has citations for everything to try and make sure that anybody that is on your board is comfortable with the actions that you're taking. But as I noted, in my experience, boards really like the idea of policy because it does feel like a pretty big return on investment for a board to take a moment to research a policy, advocate for it, use those local connections to try and get that change, and then make things better across the board for the entire state or for that local community. It really does have great dividends. So develop a public policy. It provides high-level guidance for setting your priorities. So one of the recommendations that I would have for this would be to determine ahead of time which types of policies will fit under your mission. So if you are an organization that protects and advances civil rights, then election policy, voting rights, there may be statements that you can include in that policy for the types of legislation that by default will be covered and that you'll know right away you will be supportive of. And then the next step would be for anything that's kind of in that gray area where it may not be within the scope of your mission to take a stance on it, or if a piece of legislation gets to that point where it isn't as perfect as it started out as, it's still good, it still works, it's still helpful, but where's that point at which the organization decides that they need to stop advocating for or to withdraw their support for a particular legislation? Just determining ahead of time who's going to make those decisions, especially in policy. Sometimes those decisions need to be made quickly because of the nature of how fast things move. In some instances, it's really good to just set those expectations ahead of time. You can consider doing a public policy committee. At the PANO level, we have two. So there's a board committee that presents recommendations to the executive committee and to the executive director for what types of policies they believe the organization should take a stance on. And then there is also, I think it's called the Pennsylvania Nonprofit Action Network, which is a much larger group of different nonprofits from all over different sectors that are reviewing and researching much more policies to try and figure out not just whether or not PANO as an organization should take a position, but also to provide guidance to the other nonprofits within that sector. And then they're also serving as leaders to create opportunities for the nonprofit community within different regions of the state to start reaching out to their elected officials. So if you are not a PANO member yet, and you're interested in public advocacy, that might be a great route to check out. They're also doing a dashboard that is going to have tracked legislation available to their members as well that on issues that impact the nonprofit community. And then again, determining what issues you want to prioritize. That might help give you a little bit of a starting point, a jumping off point, to make it easier for the organization to get the process started by narrowing the focus and then figuring out which staff members and legislators they need to be communicated with and the best way to make those communications happen. Okay, so we're going to do our very first poll, which would be, what is one issue that you would like to lobby for in 2026? And this is just to kind of get you thinking about the topics that would be either personally meaningful for you to try and make change in or are mission critical to your organization. So I will just open that poll right now. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list. This was just a smattering of options. So if you have something else, I don't know that that would be an option, but you can certainly drop that into the chat. Oh, I actually have an other in there. Or more more appropriately, Courtney put another in there. Just give it another minute because I think we have some people who haven't had an opportunity to participate yet. Okay. So we'll share the results. It looks like the most advocated for is going to be around housing and homelessness, which makes a lot of sense given everything. Oh, I didn't even realize that those were all separate clicks. I apologize. Which is certainly an incredibly pressing issue, and we've heard a lot, I mean, since frankly the beginning of the pandemic, around all of the housing issues, and there are a lot of interesting things happening at the policy level. In my day job, I just completed a new housing policy roundup that's about 4 pages long that includes all of the different policies that have been undertaken across the country to change the different policies around housing, from zoning reforms to supply measures to affordable housing regulations. So there's a lot going on right there. So this is a great time if that is your issue. Of course, childcare, we're seeing really interesting things happening with different chambers of commerce, which is really encouraging, using childcare more as a workforce development issue. So great time for everyone to start getting involved. Okay, so turning more to lobbying basics and how a bill actually gets signed into law. So this is a little bit of your, I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill, if you remember your Schoolhouse Rock. So the basic, we'll put this in context for Pennsylvania specifically, but that's helpful because Congress actually mirrors what Pennsylvania does, so they're very similar. A piece of legislation is authored either in the House or the Senate or both. But even if an identical bill is introduced at the House and the Senate at the same time, both of them would have to make it all the way through the process, and only one would go up to the governor. So you'll see this very frequently, that bills will be introduced that are functionally the same in both the House and the Senate, because it gives the advocacy community the ability to lobby both chambers at the same time. If a bill is only in the House and it hasn't moved yet, and you're trying to lay the foundation in the Senate, they don't really want to hear about it because they're like, if this is not over from the House yet, I'm like not going to spend time on it. So it does give you the ability to simultaneously lobby and then try to figure out what's the best path forward for that particular legislation. There's also a lot more House members than there are Senate members in Pennsylvania. So in the House, there are 203 members. In the Senate, there are only 50. So there's much more pressure and more bills introduced in the House, which means in a lot of cases, the Senate bills are more likely to get passed just because there's fewer of them. And when they're doing the trading between them, the numbers try to even out a little bit more. So a majority of members of the chamber have to vote to support the bill. Most of the time, that is going to be that 201 in the House. It varies a little bit depending if somebody is on leave or unable to make the vote, but that would generally, I'm sorry, 101. That would generally be the threshold. And then it's a simple majority in the Senate as well before going on to the governor. There are a number of procedural votes before it gets to the entire chamber for a vote. So that's generally a committee that is made up of somewhere between 8 and 15 members, depending if it's House or Senate. And a majority of those committee members must pass it. And then it has another stop in a secondary committee, just mostly for technical review. So that can be the Appropriations Committee or the Rules Committee. So bottom line, a piece of legislation would have to get a minimum of, let's see, 3 votes in either chamber. So 6 votes total minimum to make it to the governor. So there's a lot of opportunities for changes, for amendments, and for frustration on behalf of the people that are trying to get this bill through. Legislation was never designed to be a quick and easy remedy, but it is effective because it does change the law going forward. So sometimes things can move much, much quicker, but it's not at all uncommon in Pennsylvania, where every member can introduce as many bills as they want for a bill to take 3, 4, 5, 6 years before it ever gets to the governor's signature, even though it is something that is broadly supported and very popular. Sometimes it's something as simple as a personality conflict that can prevent a bill from getting all the way through. But more often it's just overall politics that's happening between the chambers. So it is a slow and cumbersome process to get it back and forth from one to the other. But when it does, it's a really good day. And it is the same up at the federal level, where it just goes back and forth between Congress and the Senate and eventually goes to the president for signature rather than to the governor. So federal legislative session is the same as in Pennsylvania. They're 2 years in length. They start in January. They typically go until like April or June. That's when the budgets start getting negotiated. The legislative activity slows during this period, but it doesn't stop because they tend to have session through this budget debate, and there's nothing for all of those members to do during that point. So committees will continue to be active and push through non-controversial legislation during that time period just to keep them busy. So summers are a good time to go and have your in-person lobby days if you're thinking about that as an organization. Because they are kind of hanging out for the most part and not terribly busy, but they are all in session, so they're all in one location. Any legislation that is not passed into law by the end of that session, so that will be December of 2026, has to be reintroduced the next session and start all over. If it received a vote in committee the previous session, that does not count. It's got to go back through that whole process all over again. So this is the breakdown of how many members of Congress there are, as well as Pennsylvania's General Assembly, and of course, county commissioners, which is also true here in York County. We have 3 commissioners. These are the links, which I'm sure we'll make available after this as well, to look up who your local officials are. In Pennsylvania's General Assembly, they've recently redone the website. Some of it really works well, and some of it's a little bit confusing. It might just be easier to Google it in some cases. But another wonderful thing about the state legislative website is that you can create a login and you can then create alerts for yourself, which is awesome. So you can track particular pieces of legislation or particular committees and see what they're up to. They'll automatically email you like a daily summary or a weekly summary, and it makes it very simple to track legislation. Okay, so another poll. Now that we know a little bit more about what the differences are at the different levels of government, so Congress that deals with your 501c3 number and took away the federal tax deduction for nonprofit donations, General Assembly at the state level, which does pretty much everything else, the administration, which does all those Superfund rules that govern, how many fire extinguishers need to be in any particular room, local officials that can determine zoning or none of the above, which I'm really hoping nobody chooses at this point, but we'll launch that poll now. So which one of these levels of government do you think would be most useful for your particular organization? Oh, interesting. A lot of local. Okay, so we're seeing about a 70-30 split between local officials and the General Assembly, and not a lot of interest in lobbying federally. So that's really interesting. Okay. So how do you actually make your case once you have determined who you need to be advocating in front of, and you know what issue is that you want to talk about? So how do you actually go about doing this? So it's really important that you think about the messenger that you are going to bring. So this is a great opportunity to engage, your volunteers that are wonderful spokespeople, and ask them to take this on. Board members is another great option. Or if your team has time, partner up with another organization or go and attend a lobby day. Like, for example, the child care advocacy organizations have a fabulous lobby day every year, and they're always looking for people to come up. Unfortunately, being in Harrisburg or DC, either way, is not terribly far for York County. So that is super helpful. So we'll probably skip that one. So we'll talk a little bit about how to get yourself together for the meeting. So the first step is to kind of collect the data. You don't want your data to be super heavy. Again, I would approach this more like a donor meeting than I would something that you should have a ton of data and a white paper for. Elected officials and their staff are incredibly busy. So you're thinking more along the lines of storytelling for these meetings. Identify yourself, make the case for why your point of view should matter. So information about how large your membership is, or how many individuals you interact with that are in the district or local to that elected official is very helpful, as well as, very simple data points that can illustrate your impact or illustrate why the issue is so important. Narrow down exactly what you want to convey. Like, ask yourself, what would I like them to take away from this meeting, and make sure that that is clearly identified. And then create like just a one pager, something very basic that you can leave behind you that has your contact information or the contact information for your organization, so that they can follow up with additional questions and thoughts. Next is just scheduling that meeting. Be aware that it's going to be very short. These meetings tend to happen like back to back to back to back, especially on session days. If you have the ability, doing something in the district for the legislator is far more effective. So meeting them in their local offices rather than in Harrisburg. If you're trying to hit everybody in the county because you're a county-wide organization, then doing something in Harrisburg would make the most sense. But if you are thinking of something a little more local, or just trying to build a relationship with the members of the government that represent you, and just your smaller district, then by all means go into their local offices, because that will be a much more relaxed space. There'll be more time, and it certainly is less of a drive for you. So that's always good. And then providing a follow-up. So always ask, but generally elected officials love taking photos. They never have enough for their social media feeds, and they want access to, your followings and to show that they are being supportive. So taking a picture and then following up with a thank you, either on social media or both social media and following up by email or a written, handwritten note would be great. And then continuing to contact them again. That relationship management is incredibly important. So here's just some helpful data sources. So if you want to show, like, if you're working in affordable housing, what percentage of homes are currently occupied in York County? What percentage of those are considered affordable? So I think that threshold is like no more than 30% of family income is being spent on housing. Build rates, all of that information is really helpful to make the pitch for why your issue is important. And then do a little research on your own. It's very simple. All of these state legislative and government web pages have bios on them. It's really quick to just kind of check and look and see what they have done in their previous lives. Do they still work? Are they on any boards? Because in that way, you might find some touch points to start building that relationship, and make the case for why they should care about what you are working on. Okay, so we like to reiterate that nonprofits are basically the functional part of government. A lot of services that government is going to provide are provided through nonprofits and through grant making, from the services provided by the Arc of York County all the way to, implementation of transportation vouchers and all of these things. So nonprofits are incredibly important partners. And here is just a little bit of information. Again, there's way more on PANO's website about what is happening at the state level and how much nonprofits contribute. And I know too that we recently did that report on the health of York County's nonprofit communities. So that's another wonderful data point to pull from to talk about the impact that nonprofits have to show the value and just to provide background to your elected officials. Okay, so if you would like to take a moment to just think about the 3 critical bullet points that you would use to make your case, what kind of data you would need, I would highly recommend that you just, jot something down and think about what you would like to convey in one of these meetings prior to taking the next steps on your advocacy journey. All right, so in the meeting itself, make sure you introduce yourself. Some of us get a little nervous and forget to do that. So you kind of launch into your pitch without, fully sharing who you are. So that is very helpful. And again, make sure you're leaving behind contact information because they do file that. They will also put you on their mailing list. So be prepared. But it's helpful to get those newsletters and understand a little bit more about what the lawmaker is working on. And if you have something that you think would be a good feature for the newsletter or an opportunity to have the lawmaker come to your event and then you're willing to share photos, you might also be put into that, which might help expand your reach as an organization as well. Make sure that you make your ask. Again, they are having probably 8 to 10 of these meetings a day if you are meeting with them in Harrisburg. So they're expecting you to want something from them. So if that ask is, we would love to have you speak at our, fur ball for 10 minutes about, your support of this particular animal issue, that's wonderful. If you would like them to co-sponsor a policy, just ask them to do it. And if they say, I'm sorry, I can't, well, it's a great opportunity to find out why and hopefully dispel some misinformation perhaps that they have about that policy and that you can work on. And share your story. Stories are compelling. People won't remember necessarily that your nonprofit is providing 400 jobs in the community every year, but they will remember that story of that one young person that was able to connect with employment because your organization was there to help them through that process. Especially if you bring that young person to meet them or follow up with a video from that young person. Those are the things that people will retain and help them to remember who you were. And then, of course, be flexible. I have met with constituents and organizing groups in hallways, in basically closets. I've had to share space with other meetings happening in the same room and have had to ask, hey, can you push this meeting? But if you do, then I'll be able to have the member meet with you as well. So they do try to accommodate your schedule and to accommodate your times. But please be flexible and be kind to the staff who generally are trying to juggle a million things, and session schedules are never set in stone. Committee meetings get added or taken away. So please try to be flexible with them. And on the flip side, be respectful of them and their time too. The Capitol is beautiful. A lot of times people get very taken up with it or aren't used to the kind of really strict timelines that the legislators are working with. So do try to make sure that you are on time for any meetings. And then, of course, thank them for the meeting and follow up if you say you're going to follow up. I'm going to remind you several times to follow up regardless, but especially if you've said that you're going to give them some additional information or answer a question, make sure that you do it because it will help to establish you as a trusted partner as they are moving forward with advocacy issues that would be concerning to your organization. Okay, building coalitions. One voice is incredible. 10 voices is wonderful. 1,000 voices is really a movement. So there is a lot of organizations working within the same space. So the more that we can connect to one another, especially regionally, so that's one reason why the York County Nonprofit Collaborative is so great. As much as we can connect with one another to amplify the message, the more effective we're going to be. So lawmakers are interested in issues, but they are looking for partners to help them get those issues done. And that requires voters. So the more organizations, the more voices, the more people, the more voters that care, the more likely an issue is to get passed. So get creative and think through when you're putting together that advocacy policy with your board that we talked about a couple slides ago. Make sure that you are going to include in that opportunities to reach out and network with other organizations and find ways that you can support them, and then ask that they support you so that we all raise the issues together and share that work. Okay, so this is the quiz time. So to keep you out of trouble with the IRS, these are a number of things that nonprofits are allowed to do and some things that nonprofits are not allowed to do. So we're going to go ahead and launch this quiz. So tell me what the one thing that nonprofits are expressly prohibited from doing. All right. You guys are brilliant. Yes. We as nonprofits are not permitted to campaign or endorse a candidate or party. They must be nonpartisan if anyone is going to be doing anything around elections, but voter registration drives and candidate forums and questionnaires are all permissible activities. All right. So individual political activities, these can all be done by individuals, but I would again issue that caution that as executive directors or very visible spokespeople of nonprofits, be cautious and considerate about the stances that you take that might be inferred to your organization. Okay, now tracking lobbying expenses. So because the IRS does have limits on how much time can be spent on lobbying by a nonprofit, it's incredibly important that nonprofits track those expenses. And there are examples for how to do this. PANO has a number of them, like spreadsheets essentially. And that includes time spent on lobbying, volunteer time spent on lobbying, and any direct expenses. So reimbursement of mileage, anything to research if you're using tracking software, so like Legiscan or one of those rather than the state legislative websites, all that should be documented. Now, that being said, the lobbying definitions between what constitutes lobbying at the state level and the federal level differ a little bit. So in the state level, it includes any member of state government. So that includes your Department of Health officials, the governor's office, and it includes administrative action, which is not the case at the federal level. So if you want to advocate for a rule change at the Federal Emergency Management Agency to make it easier to get reimbursements to people impacted by disasters, that would not qualify as lobbying. But doing so at the state level with PEMA, that would qualify as lobbying. Oops, I had a little mistake there with the, okay. So tracking lobbying contacts. So any communication with the purpose of influencing state legislative or administrative action and any preparation to do so is considered lobbying expenses in Pennsylvania and should be tracked. Written or in-person contacts or phone calls, that should also be tracked in terms of employee time and any negotiations. So if you are asked to provide feedback on how a bill should be written, that too would be considered as part of those lobbying expenses. Now, to be required to register as a lobbyist in Pennsylvania, the threshold is $3,000 in any quarterly reporting period. So that's $3,000 in 3 months. So that is a very high threshold for the amount of money or staff time, or spending 20 hours or more in that 3 months on any kind of lobbying. So again, very high threshold. And then the federal registration requirement is 20% of their time overall, trying to contact those federal levels, so Congress, Senate, and presidency, or not the presidency actually, just Congress and Senate for those federal requirements. So if there is any concerns from your organization, just pull up this slide because the thresholds are incredibly high before anyone who is advocating for a particular action would need to make any kind of reporting. But you will not know if you're getting close to that unless you are doing this tracking. So this is the expenditure test. This is up on the federal IRS website, which is how much lobbying you can do as a 501c3 nonprofit, which is 20% of the first $500,000. So that's $100,000 of annual lobbying expenses. And then, 15% and then 20% up to $1 million. So it would be a lot of money before anyone would be in any trouble with the IRS for lobbying. So only organizations like The NRA, the Humane Society of the United States, that are primarily advocacy organizations, would have to be concerned about these expenditure levels. At our level, it's not an issue. The only issue would be taking that position on a candidate that would get you in trouble under a completely different rule. So make sure that we do not do that. So this was everything that we went over today. And if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer those now or by email in the future. You can certainly route them, I'm sure, through the York County Nonprofit Collaborative for any questions. We're happy to get back to you. And of course, I want to reiterate what a resource the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations is.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, as Sarah mentioned, if anybody has any questions, I know we have about 5 minutes left and want to be respectful of everyone's time. There's a chat window. We'll hang around for a couple minutes just to see. All right, well, seeing none then, I think we will conclude. And as Sarah mentioned, if you want to reach out to her with any future questions, we're really grateful that you've offered to do that. And we will post this video recording on the collaborativeyork.org website. And as Sarah also mentioned, we can send a follow-up email with some additional resources. Thank you all.